Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for that introduction, and to everyone who has put so much care and labor into making today happen. I really appreciate it. So I'll just begin. Asian American sex workers are an example of what Eve Oishi calls bad Asians, counterparts to the figure of the model minority, and who challenge racial stereotypes and reject assimilation into the neoliberal American nationalist project. Employed in highly stigmatized, often criminalized professions, they are bound by the binary roles of the dragon lady or trafficking victim and have rarely had the opportunity for self-representation. This presentation examines how, against the backdrop of rising xenophobic rhetoric, anti-Asian violence, and surveillance of sex workers and migrants, contemporary Asian American sex workers have created a wide range of art, performance, and cultural programming that locates grief and mourning as political acts, while also revealing the limits of representational politics and embracing queer kinship as an alternative to heteronormative respectability. On March 16, 2021, in Atlanta, Georgia, a gunman murdered 8 people, 6 of them Asian immigrant women, at 3 Asian spas, citing his sex addiction and desire to eliminate temptation. Long considered a danger to moral authority and public health, the figure of the Asian American woman is inextricably linked to legacies of racial, gender, and sexual regulation. As Karen Shimakawa and Anne Anlin Chang have argued, American national identity and whiteness are established through the abjection and exclusion of the minority subject. The 1875 Page Act, the first restrictive federal immigration law in US history, played into popular stereotypes of Chinese women as temptresses who carried sexually transmitted diseases and threatened to lure white Christian men away from their families. Over a century later, this legacy continues to inform how Asian American women are perceived, and the Atlantic spas targeted by the shooter had been previously targeted by law enforcement in anti-trafficking stings. So regardless of what services were being offered at these establishments, they were already seen as criminal on the basis of their workers' race and gender. Ironically, police increased patrols in many AAPI communities in the aftermath of Atlanta, further endangering the most marginalized among us, low-wage, migrant, and undocumented workers. The Atlanta shooting was a political turning point that revealed a deep fracture in Asian America between those holding on to the myth of model minorityhood and those rejecting respectability politics as an effective shield from psychic or physical violence. Asianness, in fact, often obscures the way in which women like the Atlanta workers could be victimized. Kathy Park Hong has written that accounts of the poet Teresa Hakin Cha's murder frequently omit the fact that she was raped. This is a picture of Cha. And in the decades since her murder, pointing to the sexualized dimension of these crimes can still elicit controversy. Asian Americans fiercely disagreed about whether to identify the victims of Atlanta as sex workers, when none of them had publicly claimed that identity. Some argued that to do so was to further dehumanize the victims, while others argued that sex work is not inherently dehumanizing, nor a justification for violence. The sex worker is a kind of bad Asian who challenges and resists the status quo because they have already been excluded from it, or oppressed, silenced, or limited by it. Even those Asian American sex workers who are highly educated or command high hourly rates can threaten the dominant subject, given that their labor interests are often less aligned with the prototypical model minority than they are with other sex workers who may be suffering multiple dimensions of marginalization. In confronting gendered and racialized violence against Asian Americans, perhaps the question is not only what makes a grievable life, as posed by Judith Butler, but rather who deserves to engage in the act of grieving. Do white sex workers have the right to claim the Atlanta victims as one of their own? What about Asian sex workers who are college educated and American born? Or an undocumented nail salon worker who doesn't speak English fluently? Should the names of the victims be invoked by movements that attempt to eradicate anti-Asian violence through increased policing? The question of who owns these deaths and their stories is complicated precisely because even the term Asian sex worker is too broad to encompass any individual experience. Such concerns also speak to the reality of how such tragedies can be weaponized for political or professional gain without accountability toward those most impacted, the victims' families and fellow workers. And finally, this debate over whether or not the Atlanta victims offered sexual services overlooks the fact that to be an Asian woman is to already be conflated with deviance and the figure of the sex worker. The perpetrator's use of his sex addiction as motive serves as a reminder that for diasporic Asian women who blossom from invisible girlhood into fetish objects, our desirability is always tarnished by the taint of perversion and pathology. The Atlanta tragedy brought national attention to Red Canary Song, a group that has been organizing for justice for Song Yang, a Chinese migrant massage worker who fell to her death on November 25, 2017, during an NYPD police raid in Flushing, Queens, an Asian immigrant enclave of New York. For years prior to Atlanta, the grassroots collective of Asian American and migrant massage and sex workers had been advocating for safer working conditions for massage parlor workers, providing mutual aid and resources, and fighting for decriminalization of sex work and labor rights in solidarity with allied movements. In addition to offering practical services like legal aid, translation, meals, and cash support to Korean and Chinese workers, Red Canary Song has also produced performances, exhibitions, and a feature-length documentary advancing their goals. In the fall of 2023, NYU's Asian Pacific American Institute hosted an exhibition of Red Canary Song's work called Our Inner Quarters, Spaces of Work and Care. The show drew from altar-building practices that have long been part of the collective's public actions. The main space was divided into 3 sections themed around kink work, massage work, and an altar, encoded with cultural signifiers of East Asian spiritual worship, as well as sex work and BDSM. Each section utilized objects associated with labor to illuminate the typically unseen spaces in which these communities reside, work, and organize. Next to the massage table is a cart containing a rice cooker, body lotion, lube, nail clippers, pornographic magazines, and slippers, items that illuminate the sensual and mundane aspects of massage work. Meanwhile, the bondage table was restrained by leather belts and hemp rope, gesturing to the literal bonds that confine clients for erotic gratification, as well as the figurative bonds of kinship between community members. And the altar was the most dynamic part of the installation, featuring candles, incense, dried fruit, condoms, joss paper, and other offerings added throughout the run of the show. This array of objects reveals the way in which spirituality and sexuality are not in opposition to each other, but actually deeply intertwined. The white gallery wall that serves as a backdrop to the entire installation featured 8 lives, a series of portraits which uses chopping boards as canvas and honors the victims of the Atlanta shootings. Painted by a Korean massage worker named Ellen, 8 Lives was initially shown in 2022 as part of an installation at Washington Square Park, where Red Canary Song held a vigil on the 1-year anniversary of the Atlanta shootings. The artist's statement clarifies that Red Canary Song did not want to politicize individual identities and chose to only portray the victim's eyes alongside images of flowers used in spas and altars. These strategic omissions point to the limits of representation and the ethical considerations in depicting a marginalized community. Susan Sontag has contended that the appetite for pictures showing bodies in pain is as keen almost as the desire for ones that show bodies naked, which is particularly relevant in the context of an exhibition dealing with the intersections of spirituality, BDSM, and the Asian female body. Sontag was talking about traditional Christian depictions of martyrdom, mainly in painting. So to refuse representation of Asian sex workers is to evade attempts at appropriating their image for political ends, given how often they are presumed to be victims without agency. And Red Canary Song is all too aware that the image of the Asian woman migrant has been used to justify a religiously motivated rescue industry of anti-trafficking organizations who collaborate with law enforcement with little regard for the impact on the workers that they claim to be saving. What's most notable are the productive possibilities that emerge in the spaces of what isn't represented. In the absence of photographic imagery, which can compromise workers' identities, the exhibition employs everyday objects, oral history recordings, video artwork, and a library of zines and books to protect workers' privacy while still bearing witness to their experiences. Actual items were contributed by workers themselves. A worker named Lena added tiger balm ointment to the altar because of arthritis caused by years of giving massages. Yoon-hoo shared a pile of Korean and English translation notes from Red Canary Song meetings with workers, which included the dates of workers' trauma, hospital intake, and histories of surgery. MX contributed pink kitten headphones used in online meetings with both clients as well as policymakers. And the testimonies shared through this diverse media demonstrate the multiplicity of roles occupied by workers and affords nuance to the simplistic mainstream discourse on massage and sex work. While workers have undeniably suffered from precarious labor conditions and state violence, the exhibition in its totality is not a monument to their pain, but instead emphasizes their resilience, care, and inventiveness in the face of immense uncertainty. At the exhibition's closing event, I left at the altar an offering of my own, a bouquet from Sunny's Florist, a Korean family business situated just blocks from the gallery, which has been in operation for over 30 years. The evening ended with a multilingual and interethnic ritual performance by members of Red Canary Song, whose live bodies, movements, and voices animated the space. I found myself huddled together in an audience composed predominantly of East Asian female-presenting people, some old friends and others who I didn't know at all. And as the sound score played, 4 workers and a cellist entered the space. Lin unfolded a towel at the massage table, while the professional dominatrix Empress Wu put on gloves and caressed the bondage table with a chain. Meanwhile, Lisa, another massage worker, was wearing a white lace dress and white stiletto boots, walking alongside Layla, a pro-dom clad in black. They approached the altar where they brought oranges to their faces and smelled them deeply before placing them down with the other offerings. Lisa and Layla wove circles around the altar, while Lin and Wu moved across the room from each other in unison at their respective installations, and the cellist played against pre-recorded Korean and Chinese testimonies. The cellist plucked the strings of their instrument in response to the crack of Wu's whip against the bondage table, creating a sonic and tactile duet, as Lin and Wu's movements quickened and the rhythm reached a crescendo. Circling the altar, Lisa took a step forward and wavered for a moment on the heel of a single boot, before Layla gently reached out and placed hands under either side of her elbows to steady her. The two met at the center where they struck the side of a singing bowl, the sound resonating throughout the room as they clasped their hands together. And looking into her eyes, Layla said to Lisa, "We've learned so much from each other. 谢谢姐姐," which means thank you, older sister. For a moment, complete silence overtook the space before hand-folded red paper cranes were handed out and placed on the altar. Throughout the performance, the client's body remained invisible, besides its implied presence in the form of the massage and bondage table. But by making visible the workers' bodies and activating the objects in the show, the performance highlighted the deeply embodied labor of massage and sex work, and the bonds between workers whose labor experiences share as many commonalities as they do differences. In closing, it is tempting to call what Red Canary Song does feminist art, or Asian American art, or sex worker art. But what makes the work compelling is not the identity of its participants, but practices of embodied kinship which resist intelligibility. If forging new political alliances requires that women and queer people of color take the lead in birthing self-consciously constructed spaces, then Red Canary Song's intergenerational, interclass, and interethnic community building offers a case study for how to do just that. And while they do not absolve the state of accountability for its role in reproducing violence, the works make it clear that they also do not rely on reparation from the state to make whole what has been broken. I highlight this important aspect of Red Canary Song's work as a scholar who aims to shift the focus from centering damage to centering desire in my work with marginalized communities. As Eve Tug has argued, even research with benevolent intentions operate from a theory of change, establishing harm or injury in order to achieve reparation. And what she calls damage-centered research can have pathologizing consequences in which a community becomes defined through its oppression. The same can be said of artistic practices, attempting to enact healing through processes that instead re-traumatize subjects through the representation of oppressive histories. Instead of reinstating the violence that has come to pass, RCS's body of work acts as a utopian attempt to reject what Jose Esteban Munoz calls straight time, in order to dream and enact new and better pleasures, other ways of being in the world, and ultimately new worlds. Gesturing toward the criminal intimacies that offer an alternative to state legitimization as pathways to belonging, Red Canary Song's aesthetic decisions reflect the ways in which Asian American migrant massage and sex workers, their art, and organizing inform one another, in order to resist the institutional imperative of representation and to instead form an undercommons holding abolition, kinship, and collective world-making as core values. Thank you.